Hi, my name's Chris, and welcome to the Chaotic Good Story Club. I didn't post anything for the whole of 2021, and that pains me. I will get back to why in just a second, but I'm recording this on December 22nd. The winter solstice was yesterday. The light is coming back, and as part of my aims for 2022, I'm going to start posting these again and putting a lot of the background work that I've done into action. And the best way to do that, I think, kind of weird to start with a retrospective, I suppose, but let's almost clear the slate for a lot of what would have been talked about in 2021. So this is going to be some of the stories I have most enjoyed, both in books and film, through 2021. One of the reasons I haven't been posting is because I kept on getting hung up on the idea of things being perfect, of being good enough. And I always used to worry that the script wasn't good enough, or I didn't have time to get the audio right, or the setting right, and I didn't have a nice, shiny background. And that pursuit of perfection stunned me into inaction, into doing nothing. Through the course of the year, I finally got a diagnosis as being ADHD, and this sort of perfection paralysis is apparently quite a common thing for people with ADHD. And one way to push through that is to just do it, just get on with it, and put stuff out there, and not worry if it's perfect, because then you might never finish it. Especially when it's something that you're doing yourself and you don't have the luxury of an external schedule or bandmates or whatever to bounce off, etc. So, I'm going to try and do these more often. I am not going to fuss too much about things not being entirely perfect, like the chaos of my living room. You can see there's kids' toys over there. The dog will probably paddy about in the background. You may hear a little traffic. If that bugs you, I'm sorry. It's my real life. Okay? Thank you. I just want to share my enthusiasm about stories with everyone. That said, let's get on to that. So, what are the stories that I enjoyed best in 2021? At the start of the year, I set myself a really high target. I had my Goodreads intended book reading target. My target was 56, which is better than one a week. I hit that target, or close to, in 2020. But for some reason, in this second year of our pandemic, I started to find reading really, really difficult. So a lot of my reading was I think the majority of my reading this year was in the form of audiobooks. Whereas 2020 got a bit padded with comics, but for some reason I just couldn't with comics this year. Other than catching up on Die, which is excellent. So my total number of books is less, but I've picked really, really good ones to actually stick with. If I go through my good year list in sort of relatively chronological order, one of the earliest ones that was really, really good was A Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martin, which either won the Hugo last year, or it's the first one in the series, A Memory Called Empire, won the Hugo, I can't remember. And that was well deserved, whether it was for either book. I gave A Desolation Called Peace 5 stars on Goodreads, because it's just so layered and interesting, and it deals with two very, very different kinds of human politics and political systems between the Stationers and the Empire, but also interpersonal relationships. There's some very neatly layered things I haven't said to you but should have done queerness between the two main female characters. There's a really interesting kind of alien life form that is the antagonist for the vast majority of the kind of the antagonist. Arguably, the antagonist is other people. That being the tension. And it's the kind of sort of alien intelligence that we're used to seeing in books by the likes of Adrian Tchaikovsky. And it all just layers together into this fascinating, deep story, which for all of that, interstellar empires, whole species genocide potential, and ultimately it's about the communication between two people who probably love each other but have trouble with language. And both of the books, A Memory Called Empire and A Desolation Called Peace, are very much about language and interpretation and how that changes over culture, and it's just fascinating and it's so beautifully written. And go and read it. So what was next? Next one that pops out is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, which is simply beautiful. I listened to this on audiobook, and it was read wonderfully by Kuwetel Ejiofor, who has one of the most lovely voices in film, and he works really, really well as an audiobook narrator. And there was just such vulnerability and wonder in the character of Piranesi, and the way everything developed. I had suspicions that things were going to be the way that they were at the end from quite early. The core conceit of the book is it's not the most original thing, but that's in no way a criticism, But it was quite familiar to me because it reminded me quite a lot of some Clive Barker stories, and in the setting and some of the dynamics, I think. I don't want to spoil too much, but Piranesi was lovely, absolutely lovely, and imaginative. For all I'm saying, the setting wasn't original. It was definitely original enough in its way, and the actual world that Piranesi is in is very interesting. I would like to see more of that. The history of that would be truly fascinating. But that's not the story. The story is the story of Piranesi, and that's tremendous. Next up that I can see is the Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, which I'd seen good reviews for going back, I think, a couple of years. One from my friend D, who's a bookseller, and this was very entertaining. It's a young girl in a sort of alternate nation, which clearly based on China, but it's not China. It's a fantasy world. Young girl, sort of semi-orphaned, ends up being talented, getting her way into the bureaucracy and the army and things, and there's a war against an invading foreign power, and there might be some magic possible in this world, and it's all tied up in this race that the totally not China, but China empire had basically subjugated and killed off years before, and all this comes out, and there's some really interesting personal relationships and some really, really cool fight scenes and really excellent character development. Like, people who you think are antagonists end up not being, and vice versa. And it moves on at a hell of a clip, and it also has some of the most harrowing scenes I have ever read about war crimes. Massive content warning for that. Specifically war crimes against women. And yeah. And it's really interesting. And the fantastical element ramps up as you go through the book, but it's very, very grounded in reality and very compelling. And I would recommend that highly. Scrolling down, because I was having trouble reading this year, I read and listened to a lot of stuff that was very within my comfort zone. And one of my comfort zones is the Black Library, is Warhammer 40,000 and Warhammer Fiction, because that's a universe that I have been immersed in since I was like 9. So it's very comfy. For all that it's grimdark, and we're talking about deaths of planets and the worst universe imaginable, I still love it. So I read a lot of those books through the year, picking out for a special note. Dark Harvest by Josh Reynolds was a lot of fun. Brutal Cunning by Mike Brooks was a lot of fun. Scanning back to see some of the other ones, and generally the whole Siege of Terra series, the climax to the giant Horus Heresy series, I have enjoyed a lot. And the most recent one, and one that might be getting overrated because it's so fresh in my memory, is the last one, which is Warhawk by Chris Wright, which, again, Siege of Terra is the final, I think, 6-book series on the end of the 50-plus book Horus Heresy series, which is like the foundational myth for Warhammer 40k. And this one really conveys both the heart of a Space Marine Legion, which is very overlooked for the best part of the last 30 years, and a Primarch in Jagatai Khan, who was very much overlooked for the last 30 years, but has become one of my favourites. It also really digs into the scale of things, because even though at this point of the battle, the siege is down to just the core of the Imperial Palace, this still counts as, about a third of the Himalayas, which is vast. And there's one scene in the book, especially, where one of the legionnaires is riding to a different part of the palace to try and arrange something for the big offensive that they're going to go on towards the end. And he goes up and down and sort of underground through tunnels and then overground, and describes what he can see, and you see the scale of the palace from that perspective of a motorbike rider, and it's still huge. And things like that, and there's a big motorbike charge by the White Scars, which is what they do, with tanks and air support against impossible odds, and it is the single most cinematic thing in the Horus Heresy series so far, which is a big thing to say, because this is Warhammer 40,000, this is grimdark, everything is oversized and too loud and awful. It's cinematic as hell, but this in particular, I can just see it. It's like, the ride of the Rohirrim in the grimdark far future. Oh, love it. And also the general heart of Jagatai Khan and how things come at the end, and this desperate action against hopelessness is just tremendous. I love the whole thing, and that was my favourite Black Library book in the past year. Otherwise, books, I liked everything I read this year. The last thing that really, really pops out was recommended to me for many, many times over many, many years by my friend Morag, is the Traitor Baruch Cormorant by Seth Dickinson. Again, fantasy book, almost similar premise to the Poppy War. Young girl from colonized place gets groomed by this empire to be one of their agents, is incredibly talented and dedicated, and is put to work by them in a troublesome province. But because she saw her home country being colonized and the damage that was done to her family, and the abuse of young girls and the homophobia, she was still, in her core, deeply against this empire. And she works against them. And she works against them then by courting and joining the rebels in this other province. And the relationships she builds there, both with people who should be her allies and should be her foes, and it all comes to the point where you're not quite sure what way she's going. And it's masterfully written. and the way it all builds up in the relationships, the final scenes are incredibly difficult. It is so hard. It's like someone rips your heart out of your chest and squeezes it in front of your face. It is heart wrenching. I haven't found it in me to move on to the next one in the series yet, but I will because it's very very good. But it's one of those ones when there's a scene and you put the book down and you have to just sort of sit quietly and sob for a minute. But it's wonderfully constructed and very emotional and very grand, and I loved it. What else? That was books, cinema. Obviously, we have had a slight health emergency over the past year, so going to the cinema hasn't really been much of a thing. There have been a few movies that I've ordered in for like home premiere before they were usually available, but not so many. I'd say my one jaunt to the cinema this year was for Denis Villeneuve's Dune, which I thought was marvellous. Most of the criticism for that would still be most of the criticism that exists for Dune as a book, for its core themes, and there's a whole big conversation in there. I will do a video on Dune at some point because I have a lot to say. Probably nothing original, but it's what I have to say, so fine. But I thought the filming of Dune was lovely. I thought the acting was tremendous, especially Rebecca Ferguson as the Lady Jessica. I thought she was tremendous. She added so much heart to the character and how doing what she had to do as a Bene Gesserit and the wife of the Duke conflicted with what she wished to do as a mother was very, very great. She played Jessica with weakness, which was a brave choice, and I think a right choice. There's a few things I would have liked to have seen in the film that we didn't get. We didn't see Jessica in the little greenhouse in the house in Arrakis, and maybe the banquet scene I would have quite liked. But what we did get instead, at least of the banquet scene, was Leto and Paul at the grandfather's grave, which isn't in the book, but it did give Oscar Isaac, who's tremendous as Duke Leto, bestow my heart, Space Daddy, you and Anson Mount, fight it out. As you will always be what I needed you to be, and that is my son. And in that moment, you see the quality of Leto as a father and as a man, and I loved that. I really, really loved that. Lots of criticism still with, Harkonnen being fat, bad fat representation, lack of authentic Middle Eastern voices and actors in the cast. And it's like, yeah, sure, you've cast a few people who are not white, but, Zendaya and Javier Bardem are not exactly Middle Eastern either. Tremendous as they were, and this is not their fault. That is a criticism of the movie. I don't hugely want to get into that. It's probably out of my lane. I just want to acknowledge that it's there. But the choice of shots and the set design and so much, beautiful, lovely. And another thing I really liked was the starship design. How they didn't linger on the starship design. It just was. And it ended up with the starships being really incongruous, and I kind of liked that. Because you see the Highliners very briefly. There's not even a folding space scene or anything like was made such a huge deal of in the Lynch movie. The Highliners, they just hang above planets. And the ships that bring them down from orbit are very utilitarian, And I like the way that the anti-grav technology, however they do it, just seems to just work. You just float about, and that's very otherworldly because everything else is very rooted. You know, Caladan's very green with plants, and everyone's damp, and Arrakis is very too orange, and everyone's dusty. But the spaceships are just pristine. And there was the Imperial envoy, Herald of the Change. His ship was just this big, perfect white orb with a gate that came out of it. It's like something out of Hitchhiker's Guide in its ludicrousness, and I loved that. Everything else is very real and grounded, but the spaceships are other. And I liked that because it shows that for all that this is a setting and a galaxy where space travel is key to the setting, it is still not something for the common man. This is not something that normal people get to do. And that is important, I think, for the sort of socioeconomics and things that the background to Dune. And the worms were great, which is what you really want from Dune. Other movie that really sticks out in my head for this year was The Green Knight, which I adored for being visually gorgeous, for being a relatively faithful interpretation of Arthurian myth. It's not as if you can be entirely faithful, because there's about half a dozen versions of the Green Knight, at least. I thought it was really interesting or really fun in how it didn't over-explain. Stuff just happens. Like, you're never quite sure why Gawain's little fox guide decides to have a big old bark at the giants that we're going to give him a lift. It's just a thing that happens. It's just trippy as hell. The bit about what's the name? The Duke and his wife at the end. I can't remember the name. Near the end, and the sort of temptation of being with the wife was really, really good. I thought Dev Patel was outstanding as Gawain. Had both this sort of impetuousness and arrogance, but mixed with this gravitas and awareness of how he had and how he was messing up. And the desire to do the quest and everything. And again, the look, the Green Knight himself, just tremendous and trippy and beautiful. And I loved it. And that's the best of what I think I've enjoyed in stories for 2021. We'll also say parts 2 and 3 of Die, the comic by Kieran Gillen and Stephanie Hans, I read this year, which continues to be one of my favourite ongoing series. I think Die 4, which is possibly the final instalment, is already out, but I haven't got it yet. I suspect I might get it for my Christmas, so I might talk about that next year. And Die as a whole was really, really good. Yeah, I didn't script this. I had my Goodreads up in the background and was just talking out loud because I wanted to get something out today as a benchmark for starting to do this more regularly, ideally every week. I did a little poll asking what people wanted to read about with a few choices, and talking about Norse mythology was one of the first ones. So that will be coming, as well videos talking about Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, because with her recent passing, it was acknowledged that was really important for me. And also, I want to go do an ongoing series about Warhammer 40,000, because I can talk about that all the time. I will just go on and on if people are interested to hear that. And I will also be talking about a memory called Empire and a Desolation called Peace, and a bunch of other stuff, and whatever occurs to me on a weekly basis, because if I'm interested, I will talk about it at length, and if I'm not, the video won't get made, because I'm just coming to peace with doing this as the person I am. I think that's been done in one take. Thank you very much for listening. Happy holidays, Christmas, whatever, to all of you. Good Yule. Check out my blog, Patreon, Ko-fi in the description. Please like, follow, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. Yo. Thanks. There will be more, and they will probably be briefer and more focused than this, but I wanted to start. Thank you.